You just get the green screen up, Susan?
You're being recorded now, John.
Very, that's good. So let me just sort of give a little bit of background so that it doesn't feel like we're just doing a dive into the deep end of the pool. A bit of the background would basically be Chris Tamgidi and I have been kind of going to Kalapa Valley now for, I don't know, 2 or 3 times in the last 4 years, I think. Yeah. And this past time that we were at the Valley, in all of what we were doing, one of the things that came up was, is there anything that we would like to do going forward together? And long story short, what's that? Is that something that, okay. It's all good. What happened was Chris actually sort of mentioned to me about this mindful initiative that's going on in the UK, and it kind of caught my imagination, primarily because my perspective. What is that?
The phone and the computer. The link.
Just hold on. It's all right.
Can you turn off your phone?
It's not a big deal as long as it doesn't keep happening. It doesn't matter.
It keeps happening. I'm dead.
Well, we just throw it out the window with the phone.
Turning off. Turning off.
The ringer is.
You guys get the same relationship with computers that Deborah and I have. She won't let me touch anything she's doing. She's got to do it, or it didn't happen. So anyway, Chris mentioned this particular initiative, and of all of the stuff that I've seen in the landscape of things that might catch my imagination, this one caught my imagination. When I think back on all of the work that we've done with Alia over the years.
Oh, he's here.
Oh, fantastic, Danny.
Nice. Sorry.
Great. No, yes, you're right on time. We just got started here.
I was going to call one of you to do the caregiving for my son in place of the sick person who was supposed to be there this evening.
We've got Chris Tamgidi on the on
Come
Skype,
bring
and
a
if you would
chair
pull a chair
Hi,
around.
Marty. How are you? Been too long.
Nice to see you.
So, hi, Chris.
Hi, Danny.
Pull up a chair right there. I was just starting to tell people why this is happening today, and we just did about Danny, but we didn't do a check-in, and I don't think that we probably are going to do one, or we I don't think that's necessary. You all want to. And I was just giving a bit of background, and actually, part of the background is that I was. What are you laughing at? How disorganized this all is?
No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Sense of humor is a good thing. The occasion that actually brought this up in my life was when I was with Chris Tamgidi, and you'll know where it is, Kalapa Valley, which your brother may have told you that he saw me this past summer when you all were up there.
We don't talk anymore.
You were at the Celtic Lodge, and he was there with his
he
lovely
was.
wife, and well, I actually ran into him there, and you were there.
You told me.
Yeah, so that's where this sort of idea surfaced, and Chris and I were there on a bit of a retreat, and we were thinking, would there be something that might be interesting for us to do going forward together? And he raised this initiative, which he's going to describe to us here in a moment, that actually captured my imagination because of all of the things, and this will be no news to you, of all of the things that I've been involved in over the years, including Alia. The thing that seems to be the common ground for all of it, that just is essential message of the doll and the basic worthwhile work to be done. It all links back for me to mindfulness practice. This initiative is all about that. And I've been staying in touch with Jim Gimian, who's Mindful Magazine and all of his work, and to some extent Susan and Michael Chender, of course, and anybody who actually shown interest in it. And I've been very actively exploring the subject of consciousness, and mindfulness is part of that as far as I'm concerned. So I undertook to actually see if I could be some help to Chris in this work that captured his imagination. I've been supporting by spending time with Chris as a thinking partner over the last few years as he does his work in Germany. And Marty, you would be very familiar with that work. Susan, you would have some information on it. You may not so much, Danny, but Chris has been doing mindfulness work in multinational corporations, Novartis, European Space Agency, Audi. He's got a long list of very stellar multinational clients that have been bringing him in and doing this work with them. And from his point of view, it's been financially very rewarding, but it's more important that it's actually making a difference out there. And he's been invited, I believe, to this, and correct me if I'm wrong, as a poster child for the private sector, who's actually out there doing it. He's linked with universities where they're actually doing research connected to that work, and so they have actual metrics to demonstrate that the effectiveness and the changes and benefits that are to be had from this mindfulness work. Without any further ado, I guess I'm just going to, I might just say one other thing, which is that this is really just an exploration. I don't have an agenda here tonight other than to sort of see how you guys react to this idea and to see whether there's anything here that might make sense going forward. Am I smoking dope again? And this is just another flash in the pan idea, or is there something here that might make sense? And if there is, and there are some logical possibilities that might flow from this. So with that background, I'm just going to hand it over to you, Chris, if you want. So background and introduction about this mindfulness project, and Susan, if you want to give me the whole screen.
Yeah, so thanks, John. So, I think there's important background, which is the two universities in England. So the University of Bangor and the Oxford University have for years been doing mindfulness research. Okay, and in fact, it was Oxford that did the first meta-study and randomized controlled trial study of looking at the impact of mindfulness practices on people with depression. And they found, and this was published recently again, that essentially mindfulness practices are as effective or more effective at preventing relapse for depression than medication is. And of course, the side effects of medication are more severe, the costs of medication are higher. So anyway, so this kind of happened, this kind of study was published about 3.5 years ago. And around the same time, the MP, the member of parliament who had one of these universities in his constituency, Bangor Universities, his name is Chris Ruan, he's a Catholic person, and he had actually used mindfulness practices in his school, and he was a teacher. So he'd been a teacher before entering politics. And he had used mindfulness practice. And then when he found out, that this university was in this, was kind of becoming leading edge in the field of mindfulness research, he became interested, and he invited a number of the members of, Oxford University to Parliament to some event which they did, which was about 2.5 years ago.
It's just the quality of its computer.
And at that point in time, there was an interest in this, and essentially he formed a kind of a kind of all-party group, 3 people, 4 people.
When was that?
This was about 2.5 years ago.
And that was Chris Ruan that did that?
Yeah, Chris Ruan, yeah. And then the professor from Oxford, who I'll talk about in a second. And they essentially have now, so they started offering an 8-week training to members of parliament in mindfulness. And now so far they've had 7 groups go through. So 115 members of the English Parliament have gone through an 8-week mindfulness course in Parliament itself. So actually within the parliamentary, in Parliament itself, yeah. And 80 members of the parliamentary staff as well. So it's been about a total of 200 people in Parliament have gone through this program now, which essentially has been run out of the University of Oxford. And I think what happened was that they were all so enthused by what was happening to them. They're both, politics, especially in England, is very stressful. There's a lot of media coverage. There's a lot of kind of pressure, appointments. I walked through Parliament with Chris Ruan one day, and it was just, I'm sure, Danny, you probably know it. I mean, it was just a jungle of intersecting, meetings and short chats and so on. Anyway, so they started this, and it became very kind of moving for them. They would kind of, I don't know, those of you who know UK Parliament, they all sit in a room which is not much bigger than the room you guys are probably in, all 650 of them. And they're quite intense, quite, quite conflict laden. And it was kind of a very moving experience for them afterwards to go into the kind of, you could say, the next room and kind of just sit and just be quiet together and practice this, mindfulness practice together. So out of that, in May 2014, they then formed an all-parliamentary inquiry group. It's very common in Parliament. In England, I think there's like 300 of these groups, whatever. One is on heart disease, one is on obesity in the population, one is on, nuclear weapons, whatever. There's all kinds of parliamentary inquiry committees. And this parliamentary inquiry committee essentially has gone through a process of a year now of reviewing the research on mindfulness. And at the moment, there's about, last year, 1,050 new research papers were published on mindfulness research. So it's a very big field now. There's conferences performed mindfulness researchers go to, so it's kind of a big issue. So they essentially, what they found is, and it's a number of things that they found is, they found that, for example, mindfulness, as I mentioned, is more effective at preventing relapse. And so since when it was discovered 3 years ago, the NHS has now approved mindfulness as a accepted recommendation for doctors to give to their patients, okay? But for example, Chris Roon has, started a number of parliamentary, what are they called? Inquiries or, parliamentary question time. And so he found out that while this has been happening, there hasn't been much growth, however, in doctors actually knowing about this. So for example, while the NHS has said to doctors, look guys, mindfulness is more of an effective treatment for depression than pharmaceuticals are, and the cost of drugs is spiraling, they still haven't had much, increase in doctors actually recommending this kind of practices. And for example, when I was in Parliament, and I'll say why I was in Parliament too, a number of times, I had sitting next to me one gentleman who was responsible for introducing mindfulness in 400 schools in his county. And he also had done some experiments with people who were long-term unemployed. And they also had found that these practices help people who are long-term unemployed get out of this mindset of being fixed, this kind of helplessness. So anyway, so they launched what is called an all-party parliamentary inquiry committee. It was supported by a number of volunteers. So, the organization was headed by 3 members of parliament. They, had committee rooms and so on, and they would bring in researchers. And there was about, I think, 8 volunteer or part-time staff who essentially compiled the research and put together the reports. And they had it in 4 fields. The 4 fields were the judiciary, the healthcare system, education system, and the workplace. And when they started researching the workplace area, they essentially came across us. And because we essentially are leading the world's largest study on mindfulness in the workplace. So we now have 40 companies taking part in this, or 40 groups in companies, including, as John mentioned, Audi, European Space Agency, SAP, Bosch, Merck, Evonik, Novartis, all these kind of companies. And so therefore, as part of this parliamentary inquiry process, I was invited to Parliament a number of times in England, which is kind of a wacky experience for me, having 5 years ago still being out somewhere on left field, mindfulness is being something strange. But it was very interesting to talk to those politicians, and one of these events was very interesting. Lord Stone was there, and Lord Stone is the ex-CEO of Marks and Spencer's, and he's a Lord. And he said, one of the things, and I talked about our research results, and one of the most interesting things I find in our research results was that not only does it help with stress and heart rate regulation and this kind of stuff, but actually one of the most important things I found was that the quality of collaboration has improved. That people say that we listen more to each other. There's a quality of just care which has arisen in our leadership teams. Okay? Because when we sit there together in silence, when we talk about our experiences, we study the brain. So we do a lot of neuroscience. We explain to them, aspects of the brain and so on, how these things work, how compassion works, how emotional regulation works, and so on. So they found a language of talking about these things, internal things, in a non-kind of touchy-feely or a non-psychological way. So that created a lot of kind of bonding among them. So anyway, and Lord Stone also said this. He said, when I had said this about the research, he got up and said, actually, yes, this is what I found too, that the quality of us listening to each other, as politicians of differing opinions, has significantly improved with the people that I know who took part in this. Okay. So because I had the contact with Chris Ruin and some of the other MPs, I invited Chris to come to Germany, and we took him to Parliament too. And we had 3 meetings with members of Parliament in Germany. And there's, some positive reception. We're doing another round of meetings this year, hopefully. And so essentially for me, that was kind of the idea. And there was a group that there was an invitation from the Dutch Parliament. So now there's been two sets of people going through the training in the Dutch Parliament. And I think there's some interest in the European Parliament too. And now that Chris Roon is essentially, so Chris Roon did not get re-elected just now. There was a Labour, as you might have known. Labour had lost a significant amount of seats. Chris Roon was the person behind this. Or kind of one of the main drivers. He was Labour. He was not re-elected. And now he's basically being invited around the world. So he's got a group in Australia now. He was invited to Australia. There's a group now which has started there. He's starting a group in Wales and in Ireland as well. He's been invited in. So, and these are kind of Ireland, especially very Catholic, as is Wales. So it's not a religious thing. It's really a quality of people coming together, figuring out, okay, how to be human, how to be present, how to be attentive, and then to look at the research and to realize, wow, this is not just nice for us as human beings, but actually, like Chris Roon has been saying, well, actually, if we have found that this is more effective at treating depression, why aren't doctors recommending this? Why are we spending, why has the growth in antidepressive medication been over 50% in the last 6 years, and we know it has, negative side effects. Or, for example, if we know that in schools, there's a fantastic project in England where they're really finding that, mindfulness practice is really helping children in schools of different age groups, to kind of both work with their attention and with emotional regulation and with, presence. So, so there's a kind of a question, why is this not coming more to society? So anyways, so this was the purpose of this report. The report was to develop recommendations for, as a basis for encouraging and spreading the use of kind of mindfulness practices in schools, in the judiciary, in education, and in healthcare. And that's where it stands now, basically. So essentially, there's been a changing of the guard. The first group of parliamentarians who led this group, two of them did not get re-elected, one did. And she actually it's interesting, she's a conservative, and she's quite young. She's a very kind of a fast riser in the Conservative Party. And she publicly talked in Parliament about her depression, her struggle with depression, and how much mindfulness helped her. So that was very interesting to hear her to say, as a young kind of, fast rising young conservative, to actually say, well, actually, I've struggled with depression. And one of the things that's really helped me is mindfulness practices. So that kind of is very heartwarming too, when politicians are able to speak in such a direct manner to each other. So there's been a changing of the guard now. So there's a new group of parliamentarians, and they are now presenting the report and essentially wrapping up this first stage of this process. Okay. And this is what John is being invited to, 20th of October. And there's another event on the 28th of October as well. And I'm invited to both of those events, is where there's a discussion in particular on the workplace area, looking at the research on the workplace. And out of that as well, so because I've been involved in this, we're essentially the only ones, it seems, in Europe doing so much research. So essentially, we work with now 5 universities, where essentially all the training that we do, we give universities access to the data, and every participant also is a member of a research project. Okay, so essentially now we've come up with we've made a 3 to 5 year agreement with Oxford University to do research together, and out of that now we kind of have a group in England that are being, you could say, careful about how mindfulness is kind of implemented in the workplace, because there's a lot of hype around it. There's a lot of kind of this is the new thing, and the new magic pill, and if you just do some mindfulness, and it's just not true. There's no magic pill out there. So anyway, so we're also forming a group in England with some of the leading mindfulness people to kind of work on how can we ensure standards, how can we ensure that there's research, and how can we ensure that in 3 years' time, this is just not a passing phase. Okay, so those are things that have grown out of this initiative. There's been a kind of just in the education field, and especially in the workplace field, there's been a kind of a gathering of people to say, okay, let's not be kind of loose lone agents out there doing stuff by ourselves. Let's get together and talk about how to improve the quality of this, how to make sure that this is kind of sustainable and so on. So I guess those are the main points I wanted to make, and maybe I'll hand over to you for questions.
Please, so just ask any questions.
Chris, it's Tony. Is there a party distribution of support in the UK? That is, are there more supporters on one side of the house than the other?
I think Chris and Tracy was the conservative, were very careful to not let that happen because I didn't want it to be hijacked. So I think it is true that in the first group of 20, there were 16 laborers because essentially they were friends of Chris Ruin, basically. People who trusted him and who he trusted. That's how it often starts. Okay? Mm-hmm. But he as well was very careful to not make this a kind of a one-party thing. And as far as I know, it's reasonably evenly distributed. Or if it's not evenly distributed, it's evenly enough to say that it's not a one-party thing. Okay? Mm-hmm. So they have conservatives, they have liberals. So they had a conservative chair, they had a liberal chair, and they had a labor chair. They always made an effort to have 3 full chairs.
I know in the U.S., their initiative is just Democrats, which is a place to begin, but a little limitation. So that's good to hear.
Yeah.
Chris, hi. Is there any information on what proportion of the people who've done the 8-week program get so far that they begin to have an ongoing relationship to a mindfulness practice?
So I don't know from them. Okay, we have it from our data because we track that. We track people's practice and so on. So, essentially about 95% people intend to carry on practicing, either regularly, about 60% regularly, and 35% say occasionally, whenever it comes up. And we see that within kind of 10-week stuff that we do, about 40% do establish a regular practice, which is very regular. Okay? Sometimes some groups 85%. Now, how that changes 6 months afterwards, we don't know yet. Okay, we're now starting a 2-month project on that, 2-year project on looking at that with Oxford University. But so essentially, that's kind of a big question mark. But certainly, the intention is there. We did one follow-up 6 months afterwards, and we found that 60% still were either regularly or reasonably regularly practicing.
And the design of the 8-week program, how much of it was just focused on the practice itself, and how much of it was contextualized in the way I know your corporate programs are contextualized and have an arc of exploration?
So the program that were done in Parliament were not so contextualized. Essentially, they were based upon MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which is one of the key, you could say, and I think it's the most researched form. Well, not quite the most researched, but it's certainly one of the more researched forms of mindfulness training. So there's MBSR and MBCT. MBCT was developed by Oxford, in particular as a treatment for depression. And as you could say, a light version of MBCT. MBCT, of course, being derived from cognitive therapy. And there's a light version of MBCT, which is called Finding Peace in a Frantic World. Okay? And that's what they did. So it's essentially, it was like 1.5 hour sessions once a week. So lighter, much more practice, less, you could say, neuroscience. And but still, it was well received. So.
What level of priority is this expected to, or are they hoping this to rise to in the total scheme of government over there, and trying to bring something to the pub, to these various departments you mentioned, health, education, the prison system, and so on? What level of investment are they talking about here, and what benefits are they imagining for the larger economy?
Well, I think we have to see what the report says. They've been very careful about the report. I think that there's just 2 levels of what's going on. One level is the political process, where, I'm not sure how, among all the noise that exists in politics, what the exact straight line path of this will be. I don't know, So I think that's one level, which is no matter what, to kind of work on that. So, for example, they have conversations coming up with the Minister of Health. They have conversations coming up with the shadow chancellor and so on. Yeah. So that's one path they're working on to get it into the ministers. Yeah. But actually, one of the other things which has been going on, which maybe is even the more effective aspect of it, is that at the council level, at the ministry level, at the civil service level. So, for example, the head of the civil service, yeah, he's a proponent of mindfulness. Okay. The Bank of England has a mindfulness program. Okay, there's a senior person in the Ministry of Health who is pushing this. So on the one hand, there's you could say the formal legislative process, and then there's the kind of, given now that this topic has reached the level of research evidence, and a level of personal commitment in people, I think that there's a lot more opportunity to test things. So, for example, there's all kinds of experiments going on now. Like I said, for example, in the north, when I sat in Parliament, I sat next to a gentleman. He comes from County Durham, which is up in the north of England, which is really not your most progressive part of England at all. This is not where you expect people to be sitting around meditating. And like I said, they're doing experiments of long-term unemployed to say, okay, look, can we help people who are long-term employed change their mindset, become more at peace with themselves, get new energy? And again, there the results are promising. You see, so I think what's very good in England is because it started being accepted in the NHS, which is the National Health Service, that they have a kind of a track record of saying, okay, we'll try something out, evidence-based, we'll really analyze it. Oxford or Bangor as universities will be involved, and just like us in the workplace, having Oxford as being our partner is kind of, credential number one, for us in Europe. And the fact that Oxford actually said that they would work with us is a big step, because they've rejected working with a lot of other people on this topic, okay? Because they always want to say, we want to have the highest academic standards. Yeah. So because this is established, it's kind of working together, universities working together, looking at trial programs, assessing them, and then seeing the impact. There's a kind of a good process whereby you can kind of, testy things and see how they spread. So there's a kind of a very active scene in the UK of various experiments going on. And that's, I think, one of the crucial pieces.
What was the key to getting it? Do you have some questions? No, go ahead.
Well, Chris, it's going to take us in a slightly different direction, but I'm just wondering, in the early stages of this, what kind of media attention and coverage was there? Like, were the media generally positive about it, or were they trying to spin this, in some way to look like the politicians weren't doing anything or wasting money or something like that?
There was no negative media coverage of the political process that I've seen. I've seen a lot of articles in England. I mean, naturally, The Guardian was kind of one of the main proponents of this. The Guardian gave this a lot of coverage. And this came at basically the same time where a lot of the apps came out. So essentially, 1.5 years ago, there were suddenly 2 or 3 major apps with mindfulness in them. And for example, one of the apps has 2 million people who've downloaded the app. Okay, so there's a huge explosion of people who are playing with the topic. So for example, one of the companies that I'm working with is Nuffield Health. Okay, and Nuffield Health is the second largest provider of healthcare in the UK. It's a private provider. Okay. And Vodafone recently approached them, and Vodafone said to them, look, we have asked people what they would like to have if they become, as a kind of a bonus for becoming, making a contract with Vodafone, yeah? And the 2 things they mentioned were health club membership or rebates and mindfulness. Okay. So this is, so imagine a phone company, asking its potential customers what they want. So Vodafone now is doing a project with Nuffield, which we're also involved with in the background, to say that all 300,000 of our new customers this year will receive an app-based, with advice on gym membership and on mindfulness advice. So you see, so this is kind of interesting things that are happening. So there's a background movement in the society, just like there is in North America at the moment around mindfulness. There was a lot of press coverage, and then there was press coverage of the parliamentary thing. Now the sniping has started. Now if you look at the press on mindfulness, it's a lot more negative or critical. There was recently an article by one lady, she, well, we won't go into it, but you can find it online. So, and that's, of course, that's natural, because there's been too much hype. It's natural there's a backlash. Okay? But generally the press has been positive,
Thank you.
What would be other questions? Danny, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, first of all, a couple of things to start with. Despite the fact that I've attempted with my children and myself to have stillness practices that were intended to lead to meditation and mindfulness, I may be the only person who hasn't had a practice and maybe doesn't currently have a practice. And so the language is one, I may be a decent tester, as somebody who is a part of the bridge around what's the language in this that makes sense to me. And so language that makes sense to me and that I do try to practice is being present in all ways. And I think I have a decent practice of being present in all circumstances. I'm trying to block out of my mind experiences that I had with political leaders this day, where there was a complete total breach of what you would expect to be people's behavior of decency and civility, and that just sort of crept up as a result of some work that I'm doing with a large commission. And so the questions that are resonating most deeply with me from a practical perspective is, what's the starting point? What needs to be present, and what's present in what's present with the political representatives that you're dealing with that may or may not be present here, and what are the conditions that foster it? There are times when this keeps coming up in my mind when and this isn't intended to sound as discouraging as it is, but I remember being in a conversation with somebody when I was in Italy, and there were about 4 or 5 countries represented, and there was something that was not at all intended to be pejorative, but was suggested that in North America, it is not unlike our having, while there are many progressive things that have happened in the West that have influenced the world, there's also, in terms of settling into a maturity, there's a bit of an adolescence that we are still potentially psychosocially in. And this was a European who was trying to politely sort of lay that out for me.
You're backward and you're ignorant.
Well, so when I hear of the magnificent things that are happening there and the breakthroughs that you've created, what I wonder about is, what are the conditions and who are the people, and how do you begin to sort of bring some of this into reality? And so the thing I'm closest to is relates to the political personalities and the culture that exists in Atlantic Canada and Nova Scotia in particular. And I'm concerned that it would, and I'm mindful that if anyone can sort of turn a sow's ear into a silk purse, it's John Roy and his insight and tenacity to sort of transform things that you didn't see before. That, I realize, is a huge asset that would exist if there was a strategy related to this region of Canada. But at a larger level, I think at a national scene, there is likely to be a greater appetite, because I think that there is there's a greater variety of openness to new ideas amongst a group. And in fact, what I'd find interesting, I was reading a 7-page piece that was in our national newspaper this past weekend about someone who was arguably a 50-50 chance to become our next prime minister.
Trudeau, I read that same article.
Yeah,
Great article.
and it was sort of a peeling back of who the real him is.
Mm.
And what I came away from it was a sense that this is a potential tipping point in terms of what he has is he is a relatively, this is my own perception of this, a young, self-aware, modern person who knows his flaws and inability, who does yoga, whose spouse does yoga, and I suspect if she doesn't do mindfulness now, is that. And so when we look at specific acupuncture points or places to sort of introduce it, I think that bringing people into an openness about this may also rely on people just, if you're looking to really quickly break down some of the assumptions that people have about this, there may be the potential at a national level, if in a number of months' time, if there's if that were to happen, to sort of find the people around him and others in other parties who really are of that open-minded, open-hearted, open-spirited perspective, who would have that first conversation and ease their way into it. So I apologize for quickly jumping to the potential limitations regionally, but also the possibilities nationally. But I'm just so excited by what you're doing. I want to make sure that if you're starting to sort of sink into the question about is there any soil in Canada to start to plant some seed, that practically strikes me as the most promising potential start. And I don't know the national scene, but friends like Scott.
Well, you saw my email. I was with them, and the first meeting I want to have with Scott if he becomes a minister is to sit down and talk about this and the outcome of the study. And they're very, Scott even tried meditating, by the way. It's one of the Shambhala things. I talked him into that. So he and I are kind of very, very close.
Those of us with at least suggestive ADHD may have the...
I got ADHD, seriously.
Okay.
You couldn't have done a better job of bringing into the room what I wanted brought into the room, Dave. That was absolutely that's what we're up against here, Chris. And that's the challenge. Jim Gimion's take on it, I had a conversation with Jim, and I just want to hand it over to him. His take on it, and Scott's, by the way, just like you rifled right in on it, he says, you got to find the people in the government, ministers or in the staff who are meditators. That's where you've got to start. That's what he said. I don't know what did you...
So, maybe just some reflection on what Danny said. I mean, I think one point, I do think it's very important to be very cognizant of that British politics has a far worse reputation than many other countries do. Now, I wouldn't want to compare it Canada versus Britain, but, it's a pretty tough scene out there too. So I think people wouldn't have naturally assumed that would be the first place to go and do this kind of stuff. So, and I think essentially what it comes down to, and I think this is when you think what are the key conditions, I think, as you say, it's a number of people who have an open heart and are courageous. I think it's actually also having a group of people. Hello? It's also having a group of people who, if you look at what happened, the scene in the UK was Bangor University, Oxford University, and a number of people around that in, the Department of Health, Department of Education, trying things out in a small scale, yeah. So I think it's identifying people like that who are out there. It's bringing them together again and again to talk about these things so that they keep the momentum going. And then it's at some point, crystallizing something out. And, and there I think it's interesting to also see what kind of role researchers are playing in Canada. Okay, so, it just helps. Research is credibility. And there is a lot of research going on. There's a lot of research going on in Canada. I know there's some research in Toronto going on mindfulness. I think that there's some research even in Calgary, I'm not sure though, and certainly in Victoria, in Vancouver. So, those ingredients are important. The people, one or two universities, and then having some kind of crystallization point. And a crystallization point might be, and this is what I'm trying to do in Germany, is to say, okay, let's invite some members of UK Parliament to present their parliamentary report in Germany. So I'm working with a number of there's two organizations I work with. One is the Conservative Foundation. So in Germany, there are three foundations, behind the political parties. So I have some context. The personnel director of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which is the kind of the conservative foundation in Germany. He actually he's a mindfulness practitioner. He's come to our programs. And I'm also working with a company which does the chancellor, Angela Merkel. She did a community dialogue, you could say, with the German citizens and around well-being and what it means to be in a good society. Okay, so in doing that, they already connected up to the British Parliament because the British Parliament had a process on gross national happiness. Okay? So they haven't quite gone to this far in Germany. But it's kind of making those bridges. Essentially, the same people who are involved in the gross national happiness thing in England who are involved in the Enquete Commission in Germany and the Chancellor's Dialogue. And so I'm getting them involved too. So essentially what we're trying to do is in Germany is we're trying to have either the Chancellor's office, so we have some contacts in the Chancellor's office, or in Parliament to invite these members of the English Parliament to come there and to just give their kind of update and spending a day or so together, And then you never know what happens, then you just don't know. If you have 15 people in the room who are involved in, parliamentary processes, either as staff or civil service or whatever, or Parliament, then, they might say, okay, let's do this, and then things happen. So this is kind of the process I'm trying to do in Germany. And also, just so you know, by the way, I'm really only a periphery figure in the UK process. I'm involved in the workplace stream. I help write the report and so on in the workplace stream. And I gave a lot of evidence because we have, the most data. But I wasn't at all involved in the education, healthcare, or judiciary stream. So people like Chris Ruin, who John will meet on the 20th, are much more involved in that sense.
How are they organized, the group that's doing this work? Like, how big is the group? How many people are actually involved? Are there people on a payroll? Are they? What is the exact nature of the organization that's doing this?
Yeah, so there's a basic functioning. I'm sure you'll have similar processes in Parliament. There's a basic functioning for how an all-party parliamentary group works. Okay, so there's a number of chairs of such a group. There are treasurers of such a group. These are all members of Parliament. So, for example, Chris Ruin, who was one of the chairs of the all-parliamentary group on mindfulness. He is also the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on heart disease, on British-Irish relations.
So these are volunteer things, and they're organized within the government, and the government pays some administrative costs, or what?
Well, exactly. Let me get to it. So at first, there's the political level of it, which is that there are, politicians take roles in this, okay? And then there's the organizational level, the kind of an admin organizational level, yeah? And for example, the one that he's involved with on the heart, the National Heart Charity does the organizing, okay? So they do the research, they, do the logistics for the events and so on. And that's usually what happens. So for this case, the Mindfulness Initiative, from whom you got the invitation, John, are the organizing group. And that is at the moment the group of volunteers, okay? And this group of volunteers some of them got paid. There's one donor who's paying, I think, for half a staff member. And the University of Oxford is also paying half a staff member. And actually, we are feeding our research. So some of the money clients pay to us, we're paying it to the University of Oxford to do the research. So that's probably going into that process too. But essentially, so it's a combination. There's a political process, and then there's a kind of a backbone organizational process, which is stronger or less strong, And so, for example, in Germany, if I think of the backbone organizational process, I might get one or two of the NGOs involved, and then, we have to figure out, who else will be involved. That's a kind of a big question mark still.
Right. Mm-hmm. So go ahead.
Okay. Chris, it seems to me that, well, I've had some experience of government and the toll that it takes. It's both in the civil service and in politics. It's if you can maintain a certain kind of game and survive, then you're good. But when you start to fail, then there's a lot of pain and suffering. And it sounds as if this initiative in the UK started with around depression. And it seems to me in Nova Scotia there are lots of people who couldn't, in both political and in the government, who are in that same kind of pain and who aren't able to maintain whatever kinds of levels of inauthenticity you need to survive. Does that seem like the right place to start, with the people who would most be able to model the benefits to everybody else? The addictions and the depression, people who have kind of fallen by the wayside inside government.
I think it's an essential point. I don't know if it's a place to start, because of course you always have to be careful. But put it this way, if I think about Germany, would German politicians own up to that? I'm not sure, but having a person who's vocal about that is very helpful. So essentially, if you think about if you meet Chris Gruen, he's basically a walking heart. Okay, the guy is very unusual as a politician. He's all heart and no tactics, no anything like that in that sense. Or he is. He's a guy. He's actually in some ways he's a good tactician too. But so in that sense, he had a lot of acceptance because everyone basically liked him. You know what I mean? He was just kind of this kind of guy from Wales. You know, Wales was far away. You know, and then the fact that Tracy Crouch got up and said, you know, talked about her depression. I think that was a signal. And I think that, I'm not sure, again, this is curious to hear Chris Ruin's version on this. I think that certainly got a lot of people out of the woodwork. So, for example, I think that the connection to the House of Lords, because at first it was something that happened in the House of Commons, and the connection to the House of Lords, the people I met from the House of Lords were people who really were struggling, you know. These are often people who have no real training. They're just there because they're Lord so-and-so, you know? And they really struggle with the political process, you know. So I do think that that's kind of at this kind of subterranean level how these things spread. But you might not want to put the flag or the headline on that, you know. That we'll have to see.
Okay. Go ahead, Mark.
I'm one question and one comment. The question may be more for the group here, which is, I'm kind of curious about what it is in the character or the characteristics of people or the way people associate in this region. Danny, you may have some thinking about that. It might have been a rough day you had. What is it that would seem to be a limiting factor in the context of our close-in world compared to Canada as a whole? I mean, is there something in our DNA and the way we tend to relate to each other, maybe because of the sort of the presumed attitude of being benign, that may kind of hide some deeper aggression that doesn't get out as easily, but it's really, really boiling and burning in there. I don't know, but I'm ruminating on that since you made the comment, and the comment part is thinking. You may have partly answered it, Chris. That it seems like some of the ways into this are through finding exponents who are in the psychological healing professions and associations that are dealing with a lot of these things on the ground, for which a different or alternative modality might actually provide some kind of hope against work that doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. And I mean, I think we all know some people who are in those worlds who are mindfulness practitioners, but I know next to nothing about what they're really like.
One of the aspects of it is that it's non-stigmatizing, apparently. Now, that might not be true in this culture. You might be just as stigmatized for meditating as you would be for being a person with a mental health issue. I don't know. But Danny, that's an interesting question.
I think it's a great question, and I'm not sure if I've got any more insight than anybody else would. The only thing that occurs to me is
Can you hear him, Chris?
The one thing that occurs to me is a fairly basic concept as I think about momentum around certain ideas. That my sense is that there's a process when we gradually become socialized to things and we open it up as a group, and it may be something just as simple as the fact that the socializing of this has not arrived here with the same kind of concentration that it has in other areas. And I say that not as an apologist, because it's often when I'm in central Canada and I look back and I say that there are things about Nova Scotia that are in fact more, for lack of a better word, progressive or enlightened than they are in other parts of the country. And some of that relates to the way in which we hold space in Nova Scotia and the degree to which we are, I think, more practiced around the deep processes of gathering for those practitioners who are in the new way of doing things. And I think, frankly, Shambhala has had a great deal of influence on that side. So on the process of deliberation and the many streams of practice that happen around convening and hosting and the like, this part of the country, and in particular Halifax, is, I would suggest, in my experience, a leading edge part of Canada. But on the question of mindfulness, my sense is that it hasn't been in the water as much, for long, as broadly, and as deeply as the other stuff.
What came to mind as you were talking, which is only tangential to what you said, but popped to mind, was that on the kind of individual level, there's a kind of a premium on decency. But on the social level, there might be kind of a communal, social, or societal depression that is kind of, deeply embedded. It's almost like the whole society has to practice in order to kind of break this bubble that we reside in. Of feeling like, well, we're okay, but nothing can change.
Yeah, so that actually has dimensions that Susan and I have talked about from time to time, like collective psychology. And we are I'm a total amateur.
I'm going to just do one thing. I'm just going to do one thing. Chris, how are you doing for time? Because I know it's actually past midnight for you there now. Are you okay to keep participating?
I'm fine. It's very, it's interesting. I sit here and I feel the wafting of decency flow through. Just the way you talk to each other, the way you listen, the way you turn your heads when you talk to each other. It's lovely. It's like a lovely, lovely spectacle.
Please go continue.
Continue. So anyway, this will be slightly more personal, and I hope it connects to what you were saying, Marty, because I think it does. Is that that I hold a belief that the voyage of self-discovery is in the individual comparable to that of the aggregate groups of people, and that process requires a process of deep reflection on who you are and what moves you, what you're after, and how you get there. And for those who hesitate, that I see as individuals, are often those who are self-conscious and know that there's a wound that they don't want to readily face. And those as individuals who do it, who eventually, with courage, stand nakedly in the mirror and say, it's only in owning the blemishes of the wrinkles and scars and all the rest that allows you to reclaim the wholeness and beauty of who you are. There are times when, this is my own sort of view of it, that at a sort of social level, as Nova Scotians, we're trembling at the mirror. We know that there is a need. We are a people but it's, in my view, only through that process of revealing ourselves to ourselves that we will discover that all that rich, incredible beauty that
you have to have the courage to see it and to look at it and stand in it and to work with it.
So this is a more personal thing to I think some of your point, Ben, the simple, let's hold space and just sort of figure things out together, which I think we're ready for, but
And to be fair, I think the place that we're talking about is not necessarily representative of the rest of Nova Scotia or the other situation. It's pretty dysfunctional. Parliamentary democracy itself is pretty combative, full contact sport. Yeah. Just systemically, that's the way it's built. And my experience, Danny probably got a lot more intimate experience with it, but I've had long-term experience. It's very, very dysfunctional, emotionally and structurally. And so taking it on is I think going to the pinnacle, going to the summit. I think it would be, if you wanted to introduce mindfulness into the schools or sports. I mean, there are teams that are doing mindfulness as part of their training in the schools, mindfulness in the prisons. That'd be fairly straightforward. But those are easy places. You want to take on the house.
Well, I mean,
that's really tough.
This is what I found inspiring about this, is that it's actually happening in a democracy, one that we all understand a little bit about, and that is the fountainhead of a lot of our democracy. And it sounded to me like maybe there's a shot here.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because some of what is being talked about points to something I think I witnessed when I look at what's happening in this functional realm politically, at least here, is that people have lost or never had the ability to listen or to hear. And we know that it's virtually impossible to listen when you're not already accustomed to listening to yourself. I mean, understanding your own voice and your own heart, your own vulnerability. And so you see a lot of this, like, aren't they listening to each other? I find myself saying that a lot. They're not hearing each other, to discover those places where actually there ought to be some kind of common heart of aspiration, but it's sort of isolated in this obtuse way.
Mindfulness is a way into that puzzle.
But to Danny's point, it's very hard for someone to say, you would be a lot better at knowing yourself if you only stood naked in front of a mirror. That's kind of like not people say, oh, great, thank you for offering that.
If you're young enough, that works.
And by the way, we're all going to sit, we're going to go into a hall of mirrors, and we're all going to sit there naked looking at mirrors. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, everyone's going to run away.
Yeah, it is a unique ground, Chris, and this is what Danny said when he opened his comments. May very well be the case that it's an easier shot if the Liberals should have a role to play in the government in Ottawa. That might be an easier way in there.
Well, I guess I really don't know much about this, and I'm curious to learn more when I spend time with you again, John, in London. But I think that we'll put it this way, what I would encourage is whether, you can start, and I'm just pointing generally at the 7 of you in the room now, can start thinking about these things, both what would be the seed for a political process, and the seed for a political process is probably 3 or 4 people within politics who say, yeah, let's make this happen, And at the same time, however, the political process shouldn't be separate from the societal process, you see? The fact that the political process in England was able to start was because there was already a societal process going on with the universities, with the various experimentation, with the researchers coming together and so on. So I think that, when I think about Germany too, I think it's not just me going to Parliament to try to get some parliamentarians excited about this. There has to be kind of the whole body of people in the background, who kind of resonate with this. So, I think that this is a number of years project, and I think one shouldn't go too fast, but at the same time, one shouldn't be too hesitant. I think one could be surprised suddenly, I'm sorry, Danny, I don't know you that well. We met once in Windsor, Windhorse Farm, but, I think some of the language you used was very profound, I haven't often heard, although I guess I haven't met that many politicians privately, but I haven't heard many people talk about that. I think that's a very inspiring language you've used, about, the personal process and about that. And, who knows, you might have a conversation even with 5 people and you just share your hearts like that and they all kind of go, you're right, this is it, this is how we feel, let's do something about it. So I would just encourage you not to put it too far out onto the horizon, magic can happen, but there has to be a kind of a structured process of bringing people together, talking about things, meeting, thinking, and so on, and somebody to kind of nurture that process, And, we can talk a little bit more about that, John, when we're together. I have some ideas about that, but I think basically it needs some kind of group of people who say, even if we aren't empowered to do this by anybody, we'll do this. We'll start thinking about this, working about this, talking about this, sharing this, and so on. And yeah, and then see what arises. I thirdly think it's important to talk to universities, to get to know the people at the universities. How are they? Like, there's people who are involved in the universities in England, especially Mark Williams and Willem Kuyken. Willem Kuyken's the professor we're working with now, and you'll meet him, John, are exceptional people, exceptional researchers with such a deep practice of mindfulness. So, for example, Mark Williams was a skeptic. He didn't believe in mindfulness at all, okay? But he said, as a skeptic, I'm going to try applying this to depression, and was profoundly surprised at the result. And now when you hear him speak about mindfulness, he speaks kind of more profoundly than many practitioners I know, okay? So, it's very moving, and the same thing with William Quigg. So, you have to kind of find the people like that. So you have to see in the universities, are there people like that? Are there people in the civil service who've done some things with some experiments? Can we encourage some experiments? Can we get together as a mindfulness community in Nova Scotia to meet once a year to talk about experiments? Can we invite some researchers in? And I think that will be part of a process that could be. And then at some point, the political process might just kind of, take off. And, the timing might even be earlier, because I do think that there's as you say, a tremendous decency. And maybe the actual seed in Nova Scotia won't necessarily be the recoiling from the stress, because I think that's what's in England, is the recoil from the stress. But I think maybe the seed might even be the longing for decency, the longing for, some level of civility and genuineness in politics. And maybe that's actually a very profound, starting point.
There's a place for me, that's what I come from. It breaks my heart to see animosity, to see the kind of thing that Harper's done in this country. When I meet with Scott, and I read that same thing on Trudeau, and I was thinking, God, that's so hopeful. And I think that article finished by, Trudeau's ready for the country, but is the country ready for Trudeau, and that's really profound, because it really is the politics of fear versus the politics of, the opposite of fear is hope, it's love. Love, is it really ready for that? Is it ready to actually embrace that and to say, we'll face the fears and we'll deal with them, but we're prepared to be healthy again. And all of the sickness that happens in the world is coming from fear. This is what it's about. And here they are propagating it, promoting it, doing it at every turn in the highest office in the land. It's just so sad. And I think there's a possibility of a different way. And I think, for me, this is part of the language. It's something universal. It allows us to touch the most essential part of ourselves, and we do it collectively. It's very, very powerful. And it's very simple. It's incredibly, what really works for me is it's so simple. It's simple to do. It's not simple what you do when you're practicing. But the concept of how to sit and do this, it's been around for 2,500 years. And it's secular. It's not a religion. It's just a basic technique that actually has profound potential benefits.
I was thinking a little bit more practically than you, John, so sorry.
No, go for it. That's what we're here.
I'm just, sort of caught between this, sort of our opinions of the meta-narrative in Nova Scotia, which I think have some validity, but I think also can be a trap if we...
The meta what?
Sort of meta-narrative of where
meta-narrative, yeah.
In Nova Scotia, because, on some level, it all comes down to what we're doing as individuals, and everybody sort of deals with these same insecurities and fears in different ways. So for me, it's like, where can we identify the openings, and where can we identify the allies, which, a lot of whom we probably know, but like just a week ago, a friend of mine had discovered this woman who works for community services here, and she got really interested in MBSR. So she works at a correctional center for youth, or maybe like a residential home for adults at risk, for young adults at risk. I don't think it was a correctional center. So very traumatized teenagers. And she started applying MBSR in Truro. This is rural Nova Scotia. And
MBSR.
Mindfulness-based stress reduction.
John Kabat-Zinn's work.
yeah, so using mindfulness anyway in her little office there, and has gotten organizational support to travel to the Omega Institute in New York. I mean, this is mind-boggling for me to hear that someone within the public service in Nova Scotia, where we can barely ever even get permission to leave the province, got flown down to New York for mindfulness training, and is having really good results. And they're charting the positive results that are happening with the behavior in the kids, as well as I think in the culture of their office. It was like such a beautiful story for me, and there are other places where it's bubbling up, and probably more that I don't know about, but I've been making just some inquiries because I have obviously interest in this, and I'm just talking within the public service here. So, we don't have Oxford University on our side, but I don't know what other resources we could draw on here. There are a lot of resources.
There are 3 or 4 universities. I'm sure to goodness some of them are paying attention to this.
And I mean, and I think one of the things that one can do is to seed this too. So, for example, like the work we're doing, because we're inviting universities into this and we're paying for their research, that's actually a way of seeding this. So, for example, one of the things that you as a group can decide to do is to take a similar approach, or some people, and say, okay, let's go out there and let's, deliver such trainings. We have enough people who can deliver that. And let's do the research on that and make sure that that happens, so that, in 2 or 3 years' time, you have 5 or 6 research projects in the workplace, in the justice system, in the healthcare system, showing the benefits, and that is just very helpful. That then you have a community of researchers involved, they get funded, you have people who've tried it, people get excited, people making a living from it. This is one of the things I think that's very important that people misunderstand about MBSR. Yeah. Once you start making a living from this kind of stuff, you wake up every day and you think about it. A lot of us, or not me anymore, because I wake up every day thinking about this, because that's all I do nowadays, But essentially, once you are kind of in this field, that's what you do. Every day you wake up and you think, oh, how am I going to do this today? Do you see? And so then it becomes a real progression. So I think this is what's very important, to seed this kind of stuff. To see the fact that people can make a living off this, to see the fact that researchers can get funds researching it, to see the fact that conferences can happen in Halifax of researchers. I'm not aware that there's a big mindfulness research conference yet. Why doesn't Halifax do the first one? Do you see what I mean? And, I can help design it. I know a lot of people. For example, one of the fantastic people I met at this World Economic Forum, I was, Marty, I don't know if you, before you came in, I was teaching, I was invited to teach at the World Economic Forum yesterday, at their Global Leaders Program. Okay, so it's not at Davos, where they organize Davos once a year, but they asked me now to come in for their Global Leaders Program. And the person who kind of made this happen, actually, was a person who I vaguely knew from before, okay? And she knows John Kabat-Zinn, she knows Richard Davidson, she knows, personally. She organized bringing John Kabat-Zinn into Davos, she brought Richard Davidson to Davos, she brought Tanya Singer to Davos, and so on. She brought Mathieu Ricard to Davos, So there are people out there who have these connections, and so these are things that one can kind of do. One can make kind of plans around that and say, okay, let's put Halifax on the map, and be whatever, start doing this kind of stuff.
I'm just going to do a little time check here. Danny, I think, is getting to the end of his ability to be with us, and so I want to make sure we mine every little nugget that might be possible here. Is there anything you would like to leave with us, Danny, or any thoughts you have about if there's anything that we should be doing going forward, or whether there's do you have an interest in keeping up to date on what we're doing here?
Yeah, I just appreciate being part of the conversation in some way. I as I suggested at the outset, I may be a decent guinea pig for you because I don't have a practice, but I spend other aspects of my life thinking about metaphysical, the connection between the real world, the metaphysical, and our personal journey. And in that kind of way, it may, the fact that I was a politician at one time is a potential bonus. It could be a detriment as well in this on this occasion. But I'm happy in the conversation just to sort of ask the silly questions.
No, that's excellent, and to suggest little points where we might, acupuncture points that we might actually move in the direction of.
Yeah.
Where you may see pockets of this that we should who could engage.
And I also might see limitations that aren't real. I'm constantly struck by how amazing it is and how quickly it happens when somebody starts to really open up and allow themselves to discover people who are in the highest offices in this region, who are reading things and thinking about things in ways that they aren't sharing with a bunch of other people. And I'm imagining, what would it be like if others knew that these people were reading these things, and if they revealed a bit more of that to each other. And
Come out of the closet as
a bit, and just I think there are some really profound tipping points that we're just all on the edge of, and I'm so this is all. Just wish it was happening. I'm gonna. Yeah, so I won't. One of the things that John and I have had conversations with, and I'll leave on this. It's not a. It's a point of inquiry for me that I need to sort of sort through in the interest of complete transparency on. I host a personal development retreat 4 or 5 times every year at Windhorse, and there have been times when we've used mindfulness as elements of it, but it's generally not that. And so the conversation that John and I have had over years is
sitting in the water in Turks and Caicos.
That's it.
I go back to that.
Has been, on the path of whatever directions we're pointed in, to what extent is mindfulness an essential portal to in the direction that we are going in, or are there other complementary portals that people are ready for in other ways that sort of invite us in and through, where mindfulness may not be visible, and it may not be in the life journey that we are on, something that we experience, but there are other things that lead to self-actualization and purpose and wholeness that come about as a result of other things that I do believe deeply need to become part of a practice. How are those streams all coming together, and to what extent is mindfulness? Can we understand mindfulness in an array of things that meet people where they are? One of the things that I didn't say at the beginning, it feels like stream of consciousness, I apologize, is that is I have a greater understanding or a commitment to the notion of meeting people where they are, meeting individuals and collectives where they are. So what is it? What as we do that, when we think about mindfulness, how then do we go? If that indeed is a good approach, what is it that allows us to sort of really see the other and meet them where they are and invite them into something that moves them along? So there's more that would.
Had this conversation before, and I fully appreciate it. And my wife is another example of exactly what you're saying. Been hanging around me and hanging around this for all these years. But she's more spiritual than I am in many ways, and more evolved, frankly. So I think that's a very fair point. Chris, do you have anything to shed any light on that? I know I've heard some of your thoughts on this, and you're at what I've heard you say before is, well, everyone's got a different path, and this may not be everyone's path. I mean, that's what I've heard you say before. Would you say anything new here?
Well, no. I mean, I think it's very important, exactly as you say, to allow space for that, and and essentially, to I think what you say is very true. Is meet people where they are. That's why I'm very, very curious. What exactly is it that's needed? What exactly is required? Where is the longing? And so I would kind of actually, as we think about closing this call, or my part and Danny's part, you guys are still somewhere there. I would be very curious about starting a process of reflection around that, to kind of, first of all, really analyze. I have my personal analysis of the bits and pieces that came together well in England, yeah. And it'd be good to actually think about those clearly. What were those bits and pieces on the societal process, governmental process, and maybe even in the ministries what was going on, to understand that. And then to think about how could that look like? What could that be if one tries to do, to think about it in Nova Scotia or whatever in Canada in general. But I think that process of thinking is important, because I think it would be a mistake to try and move too quickly on any of these things, you see. If time is not right, if there's no resonance, But at the same time, I also think it'd be foolish to just be naive. Do you know what I mean? I think good analysis is required for a lot of things, So I think that, I would be very interested in doing a kind of a clear dissection of what happened in England, understanding that and applying it to another situation and seeing what are the pieces that are kind of necessary. And above all, I think, and this is, I guess, going back to your point, Danny, how do you bring out, because I think this is why I think just people are so excited about mindfulness, and they conflate mindfulness with humanity. Yeah. And I think the key thing is actually, how do you bring about a sense of being a good, decent human being, And I think that's why a lot of people resonate with mindfulness, because they touch back into actually what it means to be human, you see. I think actually that's the headline, actually, At the moment, mindfulness is the buzzword for that, okay? Because of, the effects and the research and so on. And because we can talk about the research on emotional, whatever, regulation, and that's good. But actually, people don't respond to research. They feel it in their heart, and they say, oh, I feel this, So I think that's very important to kind of always remain clear about that, but that mindfulness currently is the buzzword for people's longing for a sense of decency and humanity, and actually charting out what the pieces are of making that happen would be, I think, an interesting next step.
Very helpful. I'm feeling like you need to get some sleep.
Are my eyes getting smaller and smaller?
I just worry that we're going all night, and I know you've got a busy day tomorrow, and it's actually 20 to 1 where you are, so that's a long day, and this has been a lot of energy, and it's really greatly appreciated, Chris. Is there any parting questions that you have, or any parting comments that you have, Chris?
No, thank you. It's really nice. I really felt it all. It's so nice to be there with you again. I really felt like I was there in the room with you. So.
Yeah, you certainly were. Maybe we could just bow and thank you.
Chris.
Thank you.
So I'll log out.
Okay.
Bye.
Danny, that was, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.